Hey internet friends, since the last time we talked, a lot has happened. In Sherman's second march to the sea, the Wendy's was the first to be reduced to ash in the burning of Atlanta. Protests across the nation and across the world have continued. The government-sponsored Garden of Chaz has segregated, and finally, like a long shadow in the backdrop of the world stage, the threat of a very politicized plague continues to linger, and with it, the loss of our personal freedoms and liberties. At any rate, I want to address these events in this video, so let's begin. In the midst of ongoing protest over the murder of George Floyd, on the evening of Friday, June 12, 2020 in Atlanta, Georgia, after falling asleep in his vehicle in the Wendy's drive-thru, authorities were called to the scene to question the driver, 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks, who was then given a field sobriety test, resisted arrest, got into a scuffle with police, stole one of the officer's tasers, ran off with it, and according to the footage, as that officer pursued him, Rayshard turned around to point the taser at the officer, and the officer fired 3 fatal shots at Rayshard. Of course, everything on the news is curated and propagated with intent. They choose what they show and they choose what they don't show. The original footage released in Showcase conveniently left out the field sobriety test, as well as Rayshard turning around to point the taser at the officer. And for relaying these mere details, some people in the comments will tell me that I'm some right-wing nutter who loves the police, but the reality is, I resent being emotionally manipulated. I resent seeing people I love being emotionally manipulated. The Atlanta officer who shot Rayshard has been terminated per the request of Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. By the way, what a name, right? And Atlanta's police chief also resigned over the incident. On Saturday, protesters gathered around the Wendy's and also blocked the highway, and the protest eventually ended in the burning down of the Wendy's and some cars near the restaurant. Y'all know that I'm from Metro Atlanta and I've been following this story pretty closely, but I can tell you that it's rained every night since the burning of the baconators. So the weather hasn't exactly been cooperating with Sherman's second march to the sea, but we'll just see how this week plays out. As of Monday, a reported 19 Atlanta police officers have resigned from the department, with police morale across the country hitting an all-time low. We're seeing this trend of officers quitting in droves, so abolition of the police force won't even be necessary. And what will fill this void? United Nations police force? A privatized police force? I recommend everyone becoming proficient with a firearm if you're not already, and also I'd recommend police officers calling in and saying they're afraid to catch corona so they can sit back and do nothing, collecting that sweet government check while city officials orchestrate chaos and burn their cities to the ground. And I truly mean the orchestrated chaos portion of that statement, because I believe between government and the media, it is completely orchestrated, from what is chosen to be displayed on the screen as emotional stimuli all the way up to the chain of command in local governments. As we saw with Seattle's mayor giving the stand-down order to police officers and telling them to flee their precinct last week. And the city councilwoman unlocking the doors to City Hall to welcome protesters who had occupied 6 blocks in Seattle, now known as the autonomous zone of Chaz. But really, if the government wanted Chaz gone and it was such a thorn in their side, they'd simply cut off the utilities and Wi-Fi to that area. Also, I'm wondering what, beyond the new order that rises up from the rubble like a phoenix, could these politicians and their puppeteers be after when specifically putting the focus on policing? Is there an agenda to eliminate the threat of arrest amongst the upper echelon? Meanwhile, as I'm recording this on Tuesday, June 16th at 8:54 a.m. in the typical formula of the Hegelian dialectic of problem-reaction-solution, President Trump is set to sign an executive order today that will outline the administration's efforts to track officer misconduct, incentivize some departments, and involve social workers and mental health professionals on some calls. Okay, so I want to shift our focus to the main event, which really doesn't seem like the main event right now, but it's simply hanging in the backdrop, waiting and watching, ready to pounce whenever it's politically profitable to do so. The media has reported a spike in corona cases as many states are about to open back up. This comes, of course, after these massive protests and a surge of new tests being made readily available, and a potential cure in the form of a vaccine waiting on the sidelines. But the framing of this ongoing story is what really strikes me as complete and absolute absurdity. We have our TikTok nurses and physicians joining the protests across the country, saying protests should not be shut down over fears of transmitting the virus. And within the same breath, the same publication ran a headline that said hundreds of far-right protesters defy virus restrictions to demonstrate in London. Time magazine is not alone in this type of framing. We've seen it everywhere, and this is a mere example. So protests geared towards one agenda are okay and celebrated, but protests geared towards another agenda are a threat to everyone's health. Again, by pointing out this absurdity, I'm not addressing your emotions, I'm not addressing your reasons for protesting, and I'm not even taking a side. I'm pointing out that the virus response surrounding our freedoms and liberties is very obviously completely politicized. So why is it that we're taking these alleged experts so seriously? These are the officials who tell us when we can return to our jobs so we can pay our bills. These are the officials who tell us whether or not we can be with our loved ones as they take their final breath. These are the officials who tell us funerals have to be limited to under 10 people while they cheer on crowded protests across the street. You've probably noticed a lot of knee bending and kneeling happening in these protests, starting with how the officer was positioned on George Floyd's neck. Then police kneeling in front of crowds of protesters, and even all the way to people of a certain race kneeling in front of those of another race. Bending the knee has historically been a formal act of submission, usually to a king or a queen. Even in battle, it was common for surrendering parties to bend the knee as a sign of defeat, as those who bent the knee were treated with less brutality than those who did not. I am wondering aloud here if all this imagery of kneeling and submission in these protests was just priming us for what was to come as summer bleeds into fall. Yesterday, the U.S. Surgeon General was quoted saying that the virus face masks promote freedom, and if we wore more of them, we'd have more freedom. Of course, this comes months after the Surgeon General assured us that healthy people shouldn't have to wear face masks. In fact, they should stop buying them. Now we must submit to these egregious demands from highly politicized officials in order to have our freedom, as the second wave of this so-called virus looms over us like a dark cloud in the distance. I got news for you. That ain't freedom. I want to end this video with a tale that's been passed down for generations, and it's really applicable to what we're seeing play out in 2020, and perhaps it would even be a useful tale to relay to those in your own social circles. I originally heard Matt from Quantum of Conscience relay this story, and I thought it was great, so major props to him. So here we go. This is the tale of the Emperor's New Clothes. In a faraway land in a kingdom which stood long ago, there existed a rather vain emperor who loved all of the luxuries of life, especially fine clothing. It was rumored he had a different coat for every hour of the day. These rumors traveled to distant lands and attracted two unassuming swindlers who journeyed to his city, claiming to be one of the best clothes makers in all of the land, saying they made magical clothing that would appear invisible to anyone who was stupid or incompetent. The emperor was delighted and eager. He couldn't wait for this new amazing magical outfit, and second to that, he was excited to see who was unfit to be in his kingdom, as they wouldn't be able to see his outfit. He paid these men handsomely to construct his magical outfit, and snickering knowingly, the con men pretended to sew and stitch with empty looms and threadless needles, and when the emperor sent a couple of his men to go check on the garments, his men saw absolutely nothing. No cloth and no fabric. But they didn't want to admit they saw nothing because they feared accusations of stupidity and incompetency. On the day of the great procession, the clothing was presented to the emperor. But when the clothing was handed to him, he saw nothing. But the emperor withdrew any remark, fearing the label of stupidity or incompetency. After all, he was the leader of this empire. He could risk no such thing. His staff dressed him from head to toe in the garment, and then, in all of his glory, the emperor marched in the great procession in front of all of his subjects. Of course, his subjects had caught wind of the magical nature of the clothing, and not wanting to be called stupid or incompetent, they too told the emperor how beautiful the clothing was, even though what they saw before them was a butt-naked man. Finally, a child piped up and hollered, "But he's not wearing anything!" The crowd turned to the child, realizing the young boy had no agenda or reason to lie, so what the child was saying must be true. It confirmed what they too had seen but were too afraid to speak on. All at once, the crowd started chanting, "He's not wearing anything! He's butt naked!" Thus, the emperor returned to his quarters, wearing nothing but his pride. The end. So, internet friends, I want to ask you, has there ever been a time this year, or any time really, when you were too afraid to speak up when you saw the truth right in front of you for fear of the judgment or the ridicule you might encounter from your peers? Perhaps you didn't speak up because you didn't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist or something like that. And as a broader question, from whom have we accepted these facts without question? And for how long? And where has this gotten us as a society except for living together in a collective lie? You know, I always look forward to your comments. Thank you so much for watching, subscribing, and supporting my channel on Patreon. Bye.
I'm just a fake silhouette. Avoid